Che Guevara, How a Doctor Became a Revolutionary Icon, a bedtime history documentary. Picture, if you will, a photograph. You've probably seen it before. A young man with a beret, his eyes gazing into the distance, his expression both fierce and dreamy. It's one of the most reproduced images in human history, printed on t-shirts and posters, walls and murals, from Havana to Hong Kong, from Buenos Aires to Berlin. But who was the man behind that iconic face? His name was Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, though the world would come to know him simply as Che. He was a doctor who became a guerrilla fighter, a son of privilege who embraced poverty, an asthmatic who climbed mountains, a healer who learned to kill. He was, perhaps above all else, a contradiction. A man whose life defied simple categorization, whose legacy remains as contested today as it was passionate during his lifetime. Tonight, we're going to trace the remarkable journey of this complex figure. We'll travel from the comfortable streets of Buenos Aires to the jungles of Cuba and Bolivia. We'll witness the transformation of a curious medical student into one of the 20th century's most influential and most controversial revolutionaries. We'll explore not just what he did, but who he was, and why his image still resonates decades after his death. This is a story of idealism and violence, of conviction and contradiction, of a man who believed he could change the world through sheer force of will. It's a story that asks us to consider what we're willing to sacrifice for our beliefs, and what happens when dreams meet reality. So settle in. Close your eyes if you wish. Let us journey back to a different time, to the making of a legend. Art 1. Early life and background. The beginnings, Rosario and Buenos Aires. The year is 1928. Argentina is a nation on the rise. Its capital, Buenos Aires, gleaming with European elegance. Its economy bolstered by beef and wheat that flow to markets across the Atlantic. It is a country of immigrants and old families, of vast pampas and burgeoning cities, of tango music drifting through evening air. On June 14th of that year, in the city of Rosario, along the Paraná River, a child enters the world. His parents name him Ernesto Guevara de la Serna. Ernesto, after his father, de la Serna, from his mother's aristocratic Spanish lineage. He is born into comfort, into a family with connections and culture, with books lining the shelves and progressive ideas filling the air. His mother, Celia de la Serna, comes from old money but possesses a restless, unconventional spirit. They are not typical members of Argentina's upper class. They read voraciously, discuss politics with passion, and instill in their children a sense that comfort brings responsibility rather than privilege. But young Ernesto's life takes a turn when he is barely 2 years old. It begins simply enough. A day at the swimming club, the waters cool and inviting. But afterward, the child develops a cough that won't stop. His breathing becomes labored, wheezing and desperate. The diagnosis, when it comes, will shape everything that follows. Chronic asthma, severe and relentless. In those days, before modern inhalers and treatments, asthma could be a death sentence. The attacks would come without warning, leaving the boy gasping for air, his lips turning blue. His parents helpless to do anything but hold him and wait for the storm to pass. They tried everything. Doctors, treatments, climate changes. The family moved from Rosario to the hills of Alta Gracia in Córdoba province, hoping the drier air might bring relief. A childhood shaped by illness. Altagracia. Picture a town nestled in the foothills of the Sierras de Córdoba, where the air is thin and clear. Here, in a rambling villa with gardens running wild, young Ernesto spent much of his childhood confined to bed during his attacks. But these were not empty hours of suffering. His mother Celia became his teacher and his window to the world. She read to him endlessly, adventure stories and poetry, history and philosophy. The library in their home overflowed with books. French novels, Spanish classics, political treatises, everything from Homer to Freud. While other children played outside, Ernesto traveled through pages, developing an appetite for knowledge that would never leave him. But here's what's remarkable. The asthma that imprisoned him also forged something unbreakable in his character. Instead of accepting his limitations, he fought against them with ferocious determination. As he grew older, he forced himself to play rugby, one of the most physically demanding sports imaginable. His teammates would watch in amazement as he'd have an asthma attack on the field, struggle to breathe, then charge back into the game, refusing to surrender. Years later, he would tell people that his asthma taught him his greatest lesson, that willpower could overcome physical weakness. It was a lesson that would define him, for better and worse, for the rest of his life. The formation of a mind. The household where Ernesto grew up buzzed with intellectual energy. His parents' friends included writers, artists, and political activists. The Spanish Civil War dominated dinner table conversations. The family supported the Republican side against Franco's fascists. When Spanish refugees fled to Argentina, the Guevaras opened their home to them. Young Ernesto absorbed it all. He watched his mother's defiance of social conventions. She wore pants when women didn't. She spoke her mind when women were expected to stay quiet. His father, despite business failures that slowly drained the family fortune, maintained a cheerful idealism and a contempt for pretension. Both parents despised injustice and taught their children to question authority. By his teenage years, Ernesto was a curious mix of contradictions. He was brilliant, but indifferent to formal schooling. Athletic despite his illness, but also bookish and introspective. Charming when he chose to be, but often aloof. His nickname became Chancho, pig, because he rarely bathed and cared nothing for his appearance. He dressed in whatever was comfortable, which usually meant rumpled and torn. He had already developed the casual disregard for material things and social niceties that would mark him throughout his life. He read everything: poetry by Pablo Neruda, novels by Emile Zola, philosophy by Bertrand Russell, political theory by Marx and Lenin. He kept notebooks filled with quotes and observations. He was particularly drawn to stories of adventure and exploration, accounts of Ernest Shackleton's Antarctic expeditions, tales of conquistadors, anything that promised a life beyond the ordinary. The path to medicine. In 1947, when Ernesto was 19, the family moved to Buenos Aires. The Argentine capital was then at the height of its glory, a city of broad avenues and Belle Epoque architecture, of elegant cafes and passionate politics. Juan Perón had just risen to power, his movement dividing the nation between passionate supporters and bitter opponents. The Guevara family fell firmly in the latter camp, viewing Perón as a dangerous demagogue. Ernesto enrolled at the University of Buenos Aires to study medicine. Why medicine? The answer, perhaps, lay in his own experience with illness. He understood suffering from the inside. He'd watched helplessly during his own asthma attacks. felt the terror of not being able to breathe. Medicine offered a way to fight back against that helplessness, to heal rather than simply endure. But he was hardly a conventional medical student. He worked construction jobs and merchant marine vessels to support himself, developing calluses on his hands alongside the knowledge in his head. He studied seriously, but without obsession, earning good grades without the single-minded focus of his peers. The books that interested him most weren't in the medical curriculum. They were philosophy, poetry, archaeology, history. During these university years, he fell in love for the first time. Her name was Maria del Carmen Chichina Ferreira, and she came from one of Argentina's wealthiest families. She was beautiful, cultured, and utterly out of place, with the increasingly scruffy and unconventional Ernesto. Yet they were drawn to each other. She perhaps intrigued by his intensity and indifference to convention. He swept up in his first real romance. The first journey, Argentina and Chile. But Ernesto was growing restless. The comfortable life of Buenos Aires, even the bohemian version his family practiced, felt suffocating. He'd read so much about the world. Now, he wanted to see it. And so, in the southern summer of 1950, when he was just 21 years old, he made his first real journey beyond the familiar. He strapped a small engine to his bicycle and set off alone, heading north through Argentina into the rural provinces. It was a modest adventure by later standards. He covered about 4,000 kilometers over several months. But it opened his eyes. He saw poverty he'd only read about, witnessed the harsh lives of rural workers, treated patients in leprosariums who'd been abandoned by society. In one remote clinic, he met patients who suffered from diseases of poverty, malnutrition, parasites, infections that could have been prevented with basic sanitation. The experience unsettled him. His medical training had taught him how to treat diseases, but what good was treatment when the root causes, poverty, inequality, lack of access to care, remained unchanged? When he returned to Buenos Aires, he threw himself back into his studies, but with a new urgency. He wanted to finish his degree, yes, but he'd glimpsed something larger than individual healing. He began to see illness itself as a symptom of a sick society. And already, another journey was taking shape in his mind. This time, he wouldn't go alone. The Motorcycle Diaries, A Journey of Awakening. December 1951. 23-year-old Ernesto Guevara and his friend Alberto Granado stood beside an aging Norton 500 motorcycle they'd nicknamed La Poderosa, the Mighty One. They were about to embark on a journey that would change everything. Their plan was ambitious, perhaps foolishly so. They would ride from Buenos Aires north through Argentina, cross into Chile, continue up the spine of South America through Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela, covering some 10,000 kilometers. They had almost no money, no real plan, just youth and the certainty that the world was waiting to be discovered. They departed on a muggy summer afternoon, La Poderosa sputtering beneath them, their few belongings strapped haphazardly to the frame. Ernesto had promised Chichina he would return to marry her. In his pocket, he carried a few photographs and a dream of adventure. The early part of the journey was almost comic in its mishaps. La Poderosa broke down repeatedly. They slept in police stations and firehouses, ate when kindness or charm could secure a meal, went hungry when neither worked. They swam in cold Patagonian lakes, climbed into the Andes, and crashed the motorcycle so many times they lost count. But slowly, as the kilometers accumulated, something shifted in Ernesto's perspective. This wasn't just an adventure anymore. It was an education. In the copper mines of Chile, they met workers whose lungs were destroyed by years of breathing toxic dust. Men who labored in conditions that would kill them before they reached 50. The mining companies, often owned by foreign corporations, provided minimal safety equipment and paid wages barely sufficient for survival. Ernesto listened to their stories. He treated their ailments with what limited supplies he had, and he began to ask questions that went beyond medicine. Why were these men considered disposable? Who profited from their suffering? What kind of system created such inequality? They crossed the Atacama Desert, where the landscape seemed as lifeless as the moon, then climbed back into the Andes, struggling with altitude and cold. La Poderosa finally died in Chile, and they continued by hitchhiking, stowing away on boats, walking when necessary. The journey had become less about the destination than about bearing witness. In Peru, they worked at the San Pablo Leprosarium, a colony for those afflicted with Hansen's disease. Leprosy carried such stigma that patients were often exiled from society, left to waste away in isolation. The colony sat on an island in the Amazon, the patients on one side of the river, the medical staff on the other. Ernesto refused this segregation. On his birthday, despite regulations and warnings, he swam across the piranha-infested river to spend the evening with the patients. It was a gesture of solidarity that revealed something essential about his character: a willingness to cross boundaries, to reject the barriers society erected between people. As they pushed north, through the Amazon basin, through Colombia, and into Venezuela, Ernesto filled notebooks with observations. He wrote about what he'd seen: the dispossessed indigenous peoples, the peasants without land, the workers without rights, the children without hope. And he began to form a question that would haunt him. Could medicine alone address suffering that was built into the structure of society itself? When the journey finally ended in July 1952, after 7 months and thousands of kilometers, Ernesto returned to Buenos Aires. He was thinner, tougher, and profoundly changed. Chichina took one look at him, ragged, unkempt, speaking passionately about social injustice, and ended their engagement. Her family had never approved of him anyway, but Ernesto barely noticed. He'd found something more compelling than romance. He'd found a purpose, though he couldn't yet name it clearly. Completing medical school, the healer who doubted healing. Back in Buenos Aires, Ernesto accelerated through his remaining coursework with new intensity. He completed his degree in just 1 year, studying frantically, taking exams at a breakneck pace. In April 1953, he officially became Dr. Ernesto Guevara. But even as he earned his medical degree, he questioned its value. What good was being able to diagnose an illness if you couldn't address its causes? What was the point of healing individuals in a society that made people sick? His thesis, which he wrote on allergies and asthma, subjects he knew intimately, displayed technical competence but no passion. The real fire in his thinking was directed elsewhere, toward questions of social organization and human suffering that medical school had never addressed. His family assumed he would now establish a practice, perhaps specialize in allergies, given his personal experience. A comfortable career in Buenos Aires seemed inevitable. His mother particularly hoped he might finally settle down. Instead, in July 1953, just 3 months after graduating, Ernesto left Argentina again. This time, he would never really return. Got 2. The Journey to Revolution. The second journey, into the heart of struggle. This time, Ernesto traveled with a different companion, his childhood friend Carlos Calica Ferrer. Their destination was Venezuela, where Alberto Granado had found work. But the path they chose wound through the heart of Latin America's political turmoil. They traveled through Bolivia, just months after a revolution had overthrown the old oligarchy. The new government was attempting land reform, trying to break up vast estates and distribute land to indigenous peasants who'd been exploited for centuries. Ernesto watched the process with fascination, seeing for the first time that social transformation was possible, that the structures of power could be challenged and changed. In Peru, he sought out Dr. Hugo Pesci, a renowned leprologist who was also a Marxist. They spent long evenings in discussion, Pesce introducing Ernesto to more sophisticated political and economic analysis. It was probably Pesce who first gave Ernesto serious Marxist texts to read, not the simplified propaganda, but the theoretical works that attempted to explain history as a struggle between classes, that saw capitalism as a system built on exploitation. These ideas resonated with everything Ernesto had witnessed. Marxism seemed to provide answers to the questions that had been plaguing him. Why was there such vast inequality? Why did a few own so much while many had nothing? The answer, according to Marx, lay in the system itself, in the private ownership of resources, in the extraction of profit from labor, in imperialism's need to exploit the developing world. Ernesto began to see himself not just as a witness to suffering, but as someone who might help change the systems that created it. Guatemala, the Crucible. In late December 1953, Ernesto crossed into Guatemala. He arrived in Guatemala City with almost no money, sleeping in parks and cheap boarding houses, surviving on charm and luck. But he'd come to the right place at the right moment. Guatemala was attempting its own revolution. President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, democratically elected, was implementing sweeping reforms. Most controversially, he'd begun redistributing land from the United Fruit Company, an American corporation that owned vast tracts of Guatemala's most fertile land, while much of the population lived in poverty. Arbenz offered to pay the company what it had claimed the land was worth in tax documents. But United Fruit and the U.S. government cried expropriation. Guatemala City buzzed with political energy. Leftists from across Latin America had gathered there, drawn by the promise of revolutionary change achieved through democratic means. Ernesto fell in with this crowd of exiles, idealists, and activists. It was here that he met Hilda Gadea, a Peruvian economist and political activist living in exile. She was older than Ernesto, serious and committed to revolutionary politics in a way that attracted him. Where his political ideas were still forming, hers were crystallized. She introduced him to other exiles, to political meetings, to sustained debate about theory and practice. Hilda later remembered Ernesto from this period as intense and restless, charming but also remote, passionate about ideas but skeptical about people. He worked odd jobs, selling encyclopedias door to door, taking medical photographs, anything to survive while he observed Guatemala's revolution unfold. He wrote letters home, filled with growing political conviction. He mocked those who thought reform could happen peacefully within capitalism. He argued that the United States would never allow Latin America to develop independently, that imperialism required dominance and exploitation. His language grew more radical, his analysis more Marxist. And then, in June 1954, everything collapsed. The CIA, working with United Fruit Company and conservative Guatemalan military officers, orchestrated a coup. A small force led by Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas invaded from Honduras. The Arbenz government, undermined from within and afraid of civilian casualties, surrendered rather than fight. Ernesto volunteered to help defend the revolution, but there was no real resistance to join. He watched helplessly as a democratically elected government was overthrown, as land reform was reversed, as the hope of peaceful change was crushed by American power. The lesson he drew was stark. Revolution could not be achieved through elections and gradual reform. The powerful would never willingly surrender their privileges. Change would require force. This was the turning point. The doctor who'd left Argentina, still believing healing could change the world, now became convinced that the world itself needed healing, and that the cure would require violence. Mexico City, becoming Che. Ernesto fled Guatemala for Mexico City in September 1954. Crossing the border with other refugees, Mexico's capital had long been a haven for Latin American leftists, and Ernesto quickly found himself absorbed into a community of exiles and revolutionaries. He reconnected with Hilda Gadea, who'd also escaped to Mexico. Their relationship deepened, built on shared political commitment and mutual loneliness in exile. They married in August 1955, partly from genuine affection, partly from practicality. Marriage helped with immigration papers. Within a few months, Hilda was pregnant. Ernesto worked as a doctor at Mexico City's General Hospital, specializing in allergies. He also did medical photography, but his heart wasn't in medicine anymore. His real education was happening in the cafes and apartments where exiles gathered to debate strategy and dream of return. It was during this period that he acquired the nickname that would define him. Argentinians have a habit of punctuating their speech with Che, a word of address roughly meaning hey or friend. Ernesto used it constantly, and his Cuban friends began calling him simply Che. The name stuck. Ernesto Guevara was disappearing, and Che, the revolutionary, was being born. Then one evening in July 1955, everything changed again. A mutual friend arranged for Ernesto to meet some recent arrivals from Cuba, men who'd attempted an armed assault on their country's military dictatorship, been imprisoned, then exiled. Their leader was a young lawyer named Fidel Castro. Meeting Fidel, a fateful encounter. They talked through the night, that first meeting between Che and Fidel. It was one of those rare moments when two people recognize in each other exactly what they've been seeking. Fidel Castro was 28 years old, 3 years younger than Che, but already a practiced revolutionary. He was tall and commanding, with a gift for oratory that could hold an audience for hours. He spoke of Cuba's suffering under the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, of American economic dominance, of the need for armed struggle. But Fidel wasn't just talking about Cuba. He saw the Cuban Revolution as the first step in liberating all of Latin America from imperialism and exploitation. His vision was continental, his ambition boundless. Che listened, interjected, questioned. He shared his own experiences, his growing conviction that peaceful change was impossible, his analysis of imperialism and class struggle. The two men found themselves in remarkable agreement on fundamentals, though their styles couldn't have been more different. Fidel expansive and performative, Che analytical and terse. By dawn, Che had committed, to join Fidel's planned invasion of Cuba. He would go as the expedition's doctor. Hilda was pregnant with their daughter, Hildita. But Che's decision was made. This was what he'd been searching for, a chance to act on his convictions, to fight rather than just witness. Training for war. The next year and a half, Che and Fidel's group, they called themselves the 26th of July Movement, after the date of their failed barracks assault, prepared for war. They gathered in Mexico City, recruiting Cuban exiles and a handful of other Latin Americans who believed in their cause. They trained in physical fitness, weapons handling, and guerrilla tactics. Che, despite his asthma, pushed himself harder than anyone. He'd wake before dawn to run, practice shooting until his hands ached, study military strategy and the history of guerrilla warfare. He read Mao Zedong on insurgency, absorbed the lessons of partisan fighters in World War II, analyzed every revolutionary struggle he could find. A Spanish Republican veteran named Alberto Bayo, who'd fought against Franco's forces, became their instructor. Bayo was impressed by Che's intensity and intelligence, later calling him the best student he'd ever taught. But this period wasn't without hardship. Mexican authorities, pressured by Batista's government, arrested many of the would-be revolutionaries. Che spent nearly 2 months in prison, where he passed the time reading and planning. Fidel, with his lawyer's skills and political connections, eventually secured their release. Money was constantly scarce. The group survived on donations from sympathetic Cubans in exile, working odd jobs, sometimes going hungry. Che sent almost nothing to Hilda and their infant daughter Hildita, born in February 1956. His focus was entirely on the mission. During this time, Che's political philosophy crystallized further. He wasn't just a Marxist anymore. He was developing his own theory of revolution. He came to believe that a small group of determined guerrillas operating from rural areas could spark popular uprising. They didn't need to wait for perfect conditions or mass organization. The very act of armed struggle would inspire the people to join them. This theory, later called Foquismo or the Foco theory, would influence revolutionary movements across Latin America and beyond. It was audacious, romantic, and, as events would prove, both effective and dangerous. The Granma, setting sail for revolution. On November 25, 1956, 82 men crowded onto a decrepit yacht called the Granma in the Mexican port of Tuxpan. The boat was meant to carry perhaps 20 passengers comfortably. With 82 men, plus weapons, ammunition, food, and supplies, it sat dangerously low in the water. Che said his goodbyes to Hilda and 9-month-old Hildita. It was a strained parting. Hilda knew he might never return, and Che seemed almost relieved to be leaving, to finally be acting rather than preparing. The plan was to sail from Mexico to Cuba's southeastern coast, a journey of about 2,000 kilometers. A simultaneous uprising in Cuba would distract Batista's forces and provide cover for their landing. They expected to reach Cuba in 5 days. The journey became an ordeal. The Granma was overloaded and unseaworthy. Within hours, men were violently seasick. The boat leaked constantly, requiring round-the-clock bailing. They ran out of fresh water. Food spoiled in the tropical heat. The engine kept failing. Che, despite his asthma and seasickness, worked as the expedition's doctor, treating dysentery, dehydration, and despair. He also, characteristically, kept detailed notes, recording the misery with dry humor. The 5-day journey took 7. The uprising in Cuba failed, betrayed and crushed before the Granma even arrived. When they finally sighted the Cuban coast on December 2nd, 1956, they were days late, the element of surprise lost, and Batista's forces alerted and waiting. They ran aground on a mangrove swamp rather than the beach they'd planned to reach. The men had to wade through chest-deep mud and water, struggling to save their weapons and supplies. Some guns were lost. Food was abandoned. They emerged from the swamp exhausted, disoriented, and vulnerable. 3 days later, Batista's army found them. Baptism by fire, the disaster at Alegria de Pio. December 5th, 1956. The 82 men who'd landed from the Granma were resting in a sugarcane field near a place called Alegria de Pio, happiness of Pio. The name would become bitterly ironic. They'd been walking for days through unfamiliar terrain, trying to reach the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they hoped to establish a base. They were hungry, exhausted, and poorly trained for actual combat. Most had never been in battle before. At around 4 in the afternoon, the Cuban army attacked. Years later, Che would write that the most important moment of his life happened in that sugarcane field. Caught by surprise, the revolutionaries scattered in panic. Machine gun fire tore through the cane. Men fell dead and wounded. The careful plans dissolved into chaos. Che, serving as the group's doctor, faced a choice. A box of medical supplies lay to his left. A box of ammunition lay to his right. He could only carry one as he fled. He grabbed the ammunition. In that instant, the doctor became a warrior. The man who devoted years to healing chose instead the tools of killing. It was a choice he would reflect on for the rest of his life, never quite able to explain it fully, even to himself. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted perhaps 30 minutes. When it ended, the revolutionary force was shattered. Some were captured. They would be tortured and executed. Others were killed in the fighting. The survivors fled into the countryside in small groups, hunted by Batista's soldiers and local militias. Of the 82 who'd landed, only about 20 would eventually regroup in the Sierra Maestra. Fidel himself survived, along with his brother Raul and a handful of others. And Che, despite his asthma and the arduous flight through rough country, managed to escape. They spent weeks as fugitives, helped by sympathetic peasants, hiding from army patrols, struggling to find each other in the vast mountain wilderness. Che's asthma flared so badly, he could barely walk. He ran out of his medication. His lungs wheezed with every breath, but he refused to surrender, forced himself to keep moving, to keep fighting. By late December, against all odds, the survivors began to find each other. They gathered in the remote peaks of the Sierra Maestra, a small band of exhausted, traumatized men who'd survived disaster. They had almost no weapons, little food, no communication with the outside world. Most people assumed the expedition had been completely destroyed. Batista's government announced that Fidel Castro was dead. But in the mountains, hungry and desperate, the revolution was just beginning, and Che Guevara, the Argentine doctor who'd chosen ammunition over medicine, was about to discover his true calling. Hey, Part 3, The Cuban Revolution. A lifetime of conflict and constant struggle, but desolation that ceased total days and vangs of powerful winds. At first, they were barely surviving, the small band, never more than 20 or 30 in those early months. They slept on the ground, often in rain. Food was scarce. Sometimes just a handful of grain, a bit of salted fish, whatever the local peasants could spare. Che's asthma tormented him in the damp mountain air, but he'd lost his inhaler in the chaos after landing, and had to endure attacks with nothing but willpower. But slowly, they learned. They learned to move silently through the forest, to read the land, to fight, and then vanish. They studied guerrilla warfare, not from books anymore, but from necessity. Every encounter with government forces taught them something. About ambush, about retreat, about turning their weakness in numbers into strength through mobility and surprise. Che proved to be a natural guerrilla fighter. His medical training made him meticulous and analytical. His reading of revolutionary theory gave him strategic vision. His asthma-forged willpower made him relentless. And, perhaps most importantly, he had no sentimentality about violence. While others might hesitate, Che could make hard decisions coldly, pragmatically. Fidel recognized Che's value quickly. Though Che was Argentine and the revolution was Cuban, Fidel saw in him an absolutely committed revolutionary. Someone whose loyalty was to the cause, rather than to personal ambition. By March 1957, just 3 months after the disaster at Alegría de Pío, Fidel promote Che to comandante, commander, making him second in command after Fidel himself. The New York Times interview proving they existed. In February 1957, a remarkable thing happened. Herbert Matthews, a journalist from the New York Times, made his way into the Sierra Maestra to interview Fidel Castro. The Cuban government had been insisting Castro was dead, the revolution crushed. Matthews' article, published on February 24, 1957, proved otherwise. The interview was partly theater. Fidel had Matthews meet with small groups of fighters separately, creating the impression of a larger force. But the substance was real. The revolutionaries were alive, growing stronger, and capturing the imagination of Cubans tired of Batista's dictatorship. The article changed everything. International attention focused on the Sierra Maestra. Money and supplies began to trickle in from supporters in Cuba's cities and from sympathizers abroad. New recruits found their way to the mountains, doubling and then tripling the guerrilla force. Che, mentioned in Matthews' article, began to gain his own reputation. Other journalists followed Matthews into the mountains, and they were often struck by the Argentine doctor-turned-warrior. He was articulate, could explain the revolution's goals in terms of social justice and anti-imperialism, and possessed an intensity that came through even in brief encounters. Building the revolution, hearts and minds. But weapons and recruits weren't enough. Fidel and Che understood that they needed to win the support of the peasants in whose territory they operated. This wasn't difficult. The rural poor had suffered under Batista's regime and the landholding system that kept them in poverty. But it required care and strategy. The guerrillas established rules of conduct that were revolutionary in themselves. They paid for food rather than stealing it, even when they had almost nothing. They treated peasants with respect, calling them compañeros, comrades. They held tribunals to punish crimes, including crimes committed by their own forces. When they captured Batista's soldiers, they treated wounded prisoners and sometimes released them. Che was instrumental in organizing these policies. he established a field hospital in the mountains, treating not just wounded guerrillas, but also peasants who'd never had access to medical care. He organized schools where illiterate peasants learned to read. The revolution wasn't just about overthrowing Batista, it was about building something new, right there in the mountains. Che also proved to be a strict disciplinarian within the guerrilla ranks. He had no tolerance for weakness, cowardice, or disloyalty. Deserters faced execution, carried out often by Che himself. Soldiers who stole from peasants were punished harshly. Years later, this aspect of Che's character, his willingness to kill for the cause, his coldness toward human weakness, would become controversial. But in the mountains, it created a disciplined force. The war intensifies. 1957, 1958. As 1957 progressed into 1958, the guerrilla war escalated. Batista's army launched offensives into the Sierra Maestra, bringing thousands of soldiers to crush a few hundred guerrillas. But the terrain favored the revolutionaries. They could ambush army columns, inflict casualties, and melt back into the mountains before reinforcements arrived. Che commanded his own column now, operating semi-independently while coordinating with Fidel's overall strategy. He proved to be an audacious and effective commander. His tactics were often risky: quick strikes, night attacks, ambushes along mountain trails. His men admired and feared him in equal measure. He demanded everything from them, but he demanded even more from himself. His asthma remained a constant challenge. During marches, he would fall behind, gasping for air, only to catch up hours later through sheer determination. During battles, adrenaline seemed to suppress his symptoms. His men learned not to mention his illness. Che wouldn't acknowledge it and resented any suggestion that it limited him. By mid-1958, Batista's regime was crumbling. The economy suffered under an arms embargo. Urban resistance movements launched strikes and sabotage. The army, facing an enemy it couldn't seem to defeat, suffered from low morale and defections. Batista became increasingly desperate, ordering brutal reprisals that only turned more Cubans against him. Fidel decided the time had come for a bold move. He would send columns out from the Sierra Maestra to open new fronts across Cuba. Che would lead one of these columns west, toward Havana itself. The Western Campaign, Che's greatest military achievement. In August 1958, Che set out with a column of just 148 men to cross nearly the entire length of Cuba. Their destination was the Escambray Mountains, in Los Villas province, hundreds of kilometers away, through territory controlled by Batista's forces. The journey took 7 weeks and became an epic of endurance. They marched through swamps where the water reached their chests, fighting off mosquitoes and avoiding army patrols. They went days without food. Che's asthma flared constantly in the humid lowlands, but he drove himself and his men forward relentlessly. Many fell ill. Some wanted to turn back, but Che wouldn't hear of it. He carried wounded men himself when they couldn't walk. He shared his own meager rations, and he pushed forward always, focused absolutely on the mission. When they finally reached the Escambray Mountains in October 1958, Che's force was exhausted, but intact. Now came the real work, uniting the various guerrilla groups operating in the region, coordinating strategy, and preparing to cut Cuba in half by controlling the central provinces. Che proved to be as skilled at political organization as he was at military command. He negotiated with different factions, mediated disputes, and forged a unified command structure. Within weeks, he'd transformed a collection of independent bands into a coordinated revolutionary army. Then, in December 1958, Che planned and executed his most famous military operation, the capture of Santa Clara. The Battle of Santa Clara, the turning point. Santa Clara was Cuba's fourth largest city, strategically located in the center of the island. If the revolutionaries could take it, they would effectively cut Cuba in two, isolating Havana from the eastern provinces. Batista sent an armored train loaded with weapons, ammunition, and soldiers to reinforce the city. It was a powerful symbol of the regime's military might. 400 soldiers in armored cars, enough firepower to crush any guerrilla force. Che decided to capture it. On December 28, 1958, as the armored train approached Santa Clara, Che's forces attacked. They'd sabotaged the railway tracks, causing the train to derail. Then they surrounded it, pouring gunfire into the armored cars. The soldiers inside, trapped and terrified, surrendered after just a few hours. It was an astonishing victory. The revolutionaries captured a fortune in weapons, machine guns, rifles, ammunition, and dealt a devastating psychological blow to Batista's army. If an armored train could be defeated, what chance did the regime have? Che pressed his advantage immediately, attacking Santa Clara itself. The battle raged for 3 days. Che's forces, now better armed thanks to the captured train, fought building by building through the city. Batista's forces, demoralized and uncertain, began to retreat or surrender. On January 1st, 1959, Santa Clara fell to Che's forces. That same day, in Havana, Batista fled the country with his closest associates, abandoning the regime to collapse. The revolution had won. Entering Havana, victory's sweet moment. January 2nd, 1959. Che and his column entered Havana to scenes of jubilation. Crowds filled the streets, cheering, weeping with joy, embracing the bearded guerrillas who'd somehow defeated one of Latin America's most powerful militaries. Che was 30 years old. Just over 2 years earlier, he'd been a hunted fugitive in the mountains, wheezing with asthma, with almost no hope of survival. Now he was a hero of the revolution, his name known across Cuba and spreading throughout Latin America. Fidel arrived in Havana a week later, making a triumphant progress across the island as crowds gathered to see him. When he spoke to the massive crowd in Havana, Che stood beside him, one of the revolution's comandantes, second only to Fidel himself. It must have been an intoxicating moment. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd risked and sacrificed, had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. They'd proven that a small group of committed revolutionaries could defeat a well-armed dictatorship. They'd won not just a military victory, but the hearts of the Cuban people. But victory was just the beginning. Now came the harder question: what kind of society would they build? H2, Part 4. Building a New Cuba. In the immediate aftermath of victory, the Cuban Revolution moved quickly to consolidate power and begin transforming society. Che was appointed commander of La Cabaña Fortress, a colonial-era prison that overlooked Havana Harbor. It was a position of immense responsibility and controversy. La Cabana became the site of revolutionary tribunals. Che presided over trials of Batista's officials, military officers, and others accused of crimes against the Cuban people. Many were convicted and executed by firing squad. The exact numbers remain disputed, perhaps several hundred, possibly more. Che made no apologies for these executions, arguing that justice required punishment for those who'd tortured and killed under Batista. This period reveals the cold pragmatism that defined Che's approach to revolution. He believed that building a new society required eliminating those who'd profited from and enforced the old order. Mercy, in his view, was a luxury that revolutionaries couldn't afford. Years later, he would say flatly, "To execute a man, we don't need proof of his guilt. We only need proof that it's necessary to execute him." Such statements horrified his critics and troubled even some supporters. But Che was utterly convinced of his righteousness. The revolution, in his mind, was creating a more just society, and that goal justified harsh measures. Beyond his role at La Cabana, Che threw himself into building Cuba's new institutions. In February 1959, he was granted Cuban citizenship, one of the few non-Cubans so honored. In November 1959, he was appointed president of the National Bank of Cuba, despite having no formal training in economics. When asked to sign Cuban currency, he simply signed Che, a gesture that revealed both his revolutionary casual attitude toward bourgeois formality and his growing iconic status. The agrarian reform and economic transformation. The revolution's most ambitious early project was land reform. In May 1959, Cuba passed the Agrarian Reform Law, breaking up large estates and distributing land to peasants. Foreign-owned properties, including vast holdings of American companies, were seized and nationalized. Che was one of the architects of this policy. He'd seen throughout his travels how land concentration created poverty and dependency. Redistributing land wasn't just economically necessary, it was morally imperative. Land reform brought Cuba into direct conflict with the United States. American companies and individuals owned significant portions of Cuban agriculture, sugar mills, and utilities. When these were nationalized, often with minimal compensation, relations between Cuba and the U.S. deteriorated rapidly. Che welcomed this confrontation. He'd long believed that true independence required breaking economic dependence on the United States. He pushed for even more radical measures, nationalizing not just land, but industries, banks, and foreign trade. By 1960, Cuba was rapidly moving toward a state-controlled economy. In November 1960, Che became Minister of Industries, responsible for transforming Cuba's economy from one based primarily on sugar exports to a diversified industrial economy. It was an enormously complex task, and Che approached it with characteristic intensity, but limited practical experience. He worked punishing hours, often sleeping in his office, reading voraciously about industrial management and economic theory. He instituted voluntary labor programs, where office workers would spend weekends cutting sugarcane or working in factories, both to boost production and to break down the distinction between intellectual and manual labor. Exclamation. Idealism meets reality. But economic transformation proved far more difficult than military victory. Che's theories about how to organize an economy, brilliant on paper, often failed in practice. He rejected material incentives, believing that the new man, his vision of the socialist citizen, would work not for personal gain, but for the collective good. He established moral incentives, certificates, medals, public recognition, instead of higher wages for increased productivity. The results were mixed at best. Production often fell short of targets. Workers, whatever their revolutionary enthusiasm, still needed to feed their families and responded better to material rewards than moral ones. Industries struggled without experienced managers who'd fled to the United States. Trade relations deteriorated as the U.S. imposed an embargo. Che refused to acknowledge these failures as problems with his theory. Instead, he blamed insufficient revolutionary consciousness, residual capitalism, American sabotage. He worked even harder, drove his subordinates even harder, believed that willpower could overcome economic reality. During this period, Che also began to drift apart from his wife Hilda. Their marriage had always been more political partnership than romance. In Cuba, he met Aleida March, a young Cuban revolutionary who'd fought in the urban underground. They fell in love, and in 1959, Che divorced Hilda and married Aleida. They would eventually have 4 children together. The Bay of Pigs, Invasion and Vindication. In April 1961, Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the CIA, invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. The goal was to establish a beachhead, spark an uprising, and overthrow the revolutionary government. Che was in command of forces in western Cuba when the invasion began. He rushed to the battle zone, ready to defend the revolution with the same ferocity he'd shown in overthrowing Batista. But the invasion was poorly planned and quickly collapsed. Within 3 days, the invaders surrendered. The Bay of Pigs was a pivotal moment. It confirmed Che's belief that the United States would never accept an independent, socialist Cuba. It validated the revolution's move toward closer ties with the Soviet Union. And it increased Che's international stature as one of the leaders who'd successfully defied American power. After the Bay of Pigs, Cuba moved even more rapidly toward the Soviet orbit. Fidel declared Cuba a socialist state. Soviet military and economic aid flowed in. Che traveled to Moscow and other socialist countries, negotiating trade agreements and aid packages. The missile crisis, at the brink of annihilation. In October 1962, the world came to the brink of nuclear war over Cuba. The Soviet Union had secretly installed nuclear missiles on the island, capable of reaching American cities within minutes. When American reconnaissance discovered the missiles, President Kennedy demanded their removal and imposed a naval blockade. For 13 days, the world held its breath as the 2 superpowers faced off. Che, like other Cuban leaders, prepared for American invasion. He fully expected war and seemed almost to welcome it, writing to friends that if the Americans invaded, Cuba would fight to the last person. Most remarkably and disturbingly, Che apparently advocated for the use of the nuclear missiles if the U.S. invaded, even knowing it would lead to Cuba's annihilation and possibly global nuclear war. In his mind, dying in nuclear fire while striking a blow against imperialism was preferable to surrendering revolutionary principles. The crisis ended when the Soviets, without consulting Cuba, agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for American promises not to invade Cuba. Che was furious at this outcome. He felt betrayed by the Soviets, who treated Cuba as a pawn rather than a partner. This experience reinforced Che's conviction that Cuba couldn't rely on the Soviet Union. True revolution, he believed, required complete independence, even if that meant standing alone against American power. By 1963, Che was one of the most powerful figures in Cuba, second only to Fidel. He'd achieved things he'd never imagined as a young medical student in Buenos Aires. He'd helped make a revolution, defeated American power, helped build a new society, but he was deeply unhappy. The day-to-day work of running industries, attending meetings, managing bureaucracies, it suffocated him. He was a man of action, trapped behind a desk. The revolutionary fire that had driven him through the Sierra Maestra now had no outlet. His economic policies were clearly failing. Industrial production lagged. The Soviet Union pushed Cuba toward their economic model, which Che despised as a betrayal of true socialism. He found himself arguing with Soviet advisors, resisting pressure to adopt their methods, growing increasingly isolated in his views. He began to look beyond Cuba's shores. If one small island could make a revolution, why not others? Why not Latin America? Why not the entire developing world? Che started traveling more, giving speeches at international forums, meeting with revolutionary movements in Africa and Asia. He spoke of creating 2-3 many Vietnams, spreading revolutionary war across the developing world to bog down American imperialism on multiple fronts. These weren't just speeches. Che was planning his next move, preparing to leave Cuba and return to revolutionary struggle. The comfortable life of a government minister, however important, wasn't enough. He needed to fight again. The controversial UN speech. In December 1964, Che addressed the United Nations General Assembly. His speech was a fierce denunciation of imperialism, racism, and exploitation. He defended Cuba's revolution, attacked American foreign policy, and called for global revolutionary struggle. But he also did something remarkable. He criticized the Soviet Union. While thanking them for their support, he argued that socialist countries had a moral obligation to help revolutionary movements, not just trade with them on favorable terms. He suggested that the Soviets were becoming too comfortable, too concerned with their own interests, insufficiently committed to world revolution. The speech created a diplomatic crisis. The Soviets were furious. Even Fidel, who depended on Soviet support, was alarmed by Che's public criticism of Cuba's main ally. After the UN, Che traveled for 3 months through Africa, meeting with revolutionary movements, offering Cuban support for armed struggle. He was particularly drawn to the Congo, where Laurent Désiré Kabila was leading a rebellion against the government. When Che returned to Cuba in March 1965, his restlessness had transformed into a decision. He would leave Cuba and join the revolutionary struggle elsewhere. The question was where? Africa or Latin America? And how could he leave without destabilizing Cuba's government? The farewell, leaving Cuba. The exact details of Che's departure remain somewhat mysterious, veiled in the secrecy necessary for revolutionary work. What's certain is that by early 1965, Che and Fidel had agreed that Che would leave Cuba to spread revolution abroad. In April 1965, Che wrote a farewell letter to Fidel. It was a remarkable document, emotional, idealistic, and final. Che resigned all his positions, renounced his Cuban citizenship, said goodbye to his children. He wrote that he was going to fight for revolution elsewhere, that Cuba no longer needed him, that other peoples needed his skills more. The letter also seemed to acknowledge that he might not return. there was a quality of finality to it, as if Che was saying goodbye, not just to a position, but to life itself. Fidel read the letter publicly in October 1965, after Che had already left the country. Many Cubans were shocked. Their beloved comandante had abandoned them. Others understood that Che was following his principles, carrying Cuba's revolutionary spirit to new battlefields. But where had he gone? For months, Che's whereabouts remained unknown. There were rumors he was dead, that he'd been purged by Fidel, that he was leading guerrillas somewhere. The mystery only added to his growing legend. The truth was both more mundane and more tragic. Che had gone to fight in the Congo, in one of the least successful chapters of his revolutionary career. H2, Part 5, The Final Years. H3, Congo, Revolution's Harsh Teacher. H3, in April 1965, Che arrived secretly in the Congo with a small group of Cuban advisors to support Laurent Désiré Kabila's rebellion. Che believed he could help spark a successful revolution that would liberate the Congo from neo-colonialism and inspire similar movements across Africa. It was a disaster almost from the start. The Congolese rebels were poorly organized and unmotivated. They believed magical rituals would protect them from bullets and were more interested in looting than fighting. Kabila himself was rarely present, spending his time in comfortable quarters across the border in Tanzania, while his fighters struggled in the field. Tried to instill discipline, train the fighters in guerrilla tactics, organize effective campaigns. But the cultural barriers were enormous. He didn't speak the local languages. He didn't understand the tribal politics that divided the movement. His Cuban volunteers, however brave and skilled, were outsiders trying to lead a revolution that didn't really exist. The government forces, backed by white South African and Rhodesian mercenaries, were far more effective than Che had anticipated. They had air support, better weapons, and were fighting on terrain they knew well. For 6 months, Che fought a losing battle. His fighters took casualties. Malaria and dysentery plagued the camp. Morale collapsed, and Che himself, for perhaps the first time in his revolutionary career, faced the reality that willpower alone couldn't ensure victory. In November 1965, after 7 months in the Congo, Che evacuated his remaining fighters. It was a humiliating defeat, and Che took it hard. He'd failed to create a successful revolution, failed to inspire the Congolese fighters, failed to replicate what he'd achieved in Cuba. A man without a country, the interlude. After the Congo, Che found himself in a strange limbo. He'd given up his Cuban citizenship. He couldn't return to Cuba without undermining the story that he'd permanently left to fight for world revolution. And he had no immediate place to go. He spent several months in Tanzania and then Prague, living secretly, planning his next move. He'd aged noticeably. Years of asthma, poor nutrition, tropical diseases, and stress had taken their toll. He was only 37, but he looked older, more worn. During this period, he wrote. He worked on a critical assessment of his Congo experience, analyzing what went wrong. He studied, planning his next campaign, and he decided where he would make his final stand. Bolivia. Bolivia made strategic sense in Che's mind. It was in the heart of South America, bordering 5 other countries. A successful revolution there could potentially spread to Argentina, Chile, Peru, Brazil. It was mountainous, with terrain similar to the Sierra Maestra, and it had a history of revolutionary movements and peasant unrest. What Che didn't fully appreciate was how different Bolivia was from Cuba. Bolivia's Communist Party opposed armed struggle and refused to support him. The peasants, many of indigenous descent, spoke Quechua or Aymara rather than Spanish, and had little connection to or trust in outsider revolutionaries. The terrain, while mountainous, was harsh and isolated, making it difficult to establish supply lines or connect with broader movements. But Che had made his decision. In November 1966, disguised and traveling under a false identity, he arrived in Bolivia to begin his final revolution. Bolivia, the last campaign begins. Che established his base camp in Ñancahuazú, a remote area of southeastern Bolivia covered in dense forest and rugged ravines. He assembled a small group, fewer than 50 fighters made up of Cubans who'd volunteered to join him, some Bolivian recruits, and a few revolutionaries from other Latin American countries. The plan was to build a guerrilla force gradually, win peasant support, establish a secure base area, then launch operations that would destabilize the Bolivian government and inspire broader revolutionary movements across South America. From the beginning, almost everything went wrong. The Bolivian Communist Party, whose support Che had counted on, not only refused to help, but actively opposed his presence, viewing him as an adventurer who would bring down government repression on the left. This left Che isolated from the country's main leftist organization. The peasants in the area where Che operated were suspicious and frightened. They'd never experienced the kind of repression that had made Cuban peasants support revolution. Bolivia's land reform had already distributed some land to peasants, and Che's fighters were outsiders, Cubans speaking with foreign accents, demanding support, but offering little in return. Worse, the Bolivian army, trained and equipped by American advisors, proved far more effective than anticipated. They established a network of informants, blocked supply routes, and gradually tightened the noose around Che's increasingly isolated band. Through early 1967, Che's situation deteriorated steadily. His force never grew beyond about 50 fighters. Recruits didn't materialize. The peasants didn't rise up to support him. Supply lines collapsed. Che's health, always precarious, worsened dramatically. His asthma medication ran out, leaving him gasping for breath after any exertion. He developed parasites, recurring dysentery, and painful foot infections. He looked skeletal, aged far beyond his 38 years. His diary from this period makes for grim reading. It's a chronicle of hunger, illness, failed ambushes, and shrinking hopes. Che remained determined, even optimistic at times. But the reality was undeniable. The revolution was failing. The Bolivian army, with CIA support, was closing in. They captured some of Che's fighters, and through interrogation, learned more about the guerrilla band's movements and weaknesses. They received intelligence about likely hideouts, and they trained special ranger units specifically to hunt guerrillas in difficult terrain. By September 1967, Che's force had been reduced to fewer than 20 fighters through casualties, capture, and desertion. They were constantly hungry, low on ammunition, unable to rest, always moving to avoid army patrols. Che knew the end was approaching. His diary entries grew more somber, but he refused to consider surrender or escape. He would fight to the end, whatever that meant. La Higuera, the final battle. October 8, 1967, a Sunday. Che and his remaining fighters, just 16 men, were encamped in a ravine near the small village of La Higuera in southeastern Bolivia. Bolivian Army Rangers had been tracking them for days. In the early afternoon, they surrounded the ravine and attacked. The guerrillas fought back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The battle lasted several hours. Che, suffering from an asthma attack that left him barely able to breathe, tried to fight anyway. His rifle was shot and disabled. He was hit in the leg. As soldiers closed in, he reportedly said, "Don't shoot. I'm Che Guevara, and worth more to you alive than dead." He was captured, disarmed, and taken to the schoolhouse in La Higuera. His long war was over. The last day, death in a schoolhouse. In the schoolhouse, Che sat on the floor, hands bound, guarded by soldiers. He was surprisingly calm, even chatting with his captors. When a drunken sergeant tried to hit him, Che apparently said, "Don't bother, you're only going to kill a man." The Bolivian government, with CIA advisement, had already decided his fate. They couldn't risk a trial that might become a propaganda platform for revolution. They couldn't afford to imprison him, where he might escape or be rescued. The order came down. Che must be executed. On the afternoon of October 9th, 1967, a sergeant named Mario Terán was ordered to shoot Che. Terán later said he couldn't look Che in the eyes and had to drink alcohol to steady himself. When he entered the schoolhouse, Che stood up and said something along the lines of, "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward. You're only going to kill a man." The soldier fired multiple bursts from his rifle into Che's body, deliberately avoiding the chest and head to make it appear he died in combat. Che died quickly, though not instantly, at 39 years old. His body was displayed to journalists and photographed, then buried in a secret location. The Bolivian army wanted to prove he was dead, but feared his grave might become a shrine for revolutionaries. The aftermath, making a martyr. The Bolivian government thought they'd ended the threat Che represented. Instead, they'd created something more powerful, a martyr. The photograph of Che's dead body, lying on a concrete slab, surrounded by officers and journalists. His eyes still open, his expression somehow peaceful despite his violent death, became one of the most reproduced images in history. Many noted the resemblance to Renaissance paintings of Christ, the revolutionary as sacrificed savior. News of Che's death shocked the world. In Cuba, Fidel Castro declared 3 days of national mourning. In Latin America, students rioted in protest. Around the world, those who'd been inspired by his idealism mourned a hero. But reactions were far from uniform. Many celebrated his death. The Bolivian government believed it had eliminated a terrorist. The CIA saw the successful conclusion of a counterinsurgency operation. And many who'd lived through the violence of revolution viewed Che as a killer who'd gotten what he deserved. The complexity of these reactions, Che as hero and murderer, idealist and fanatic, liberator and oppressor, would define his legacy. Finding Che, the body returns home. For 30 years, Che's remains lay in an unmarked grave near the airport in Valle Grande, Bolivia. The Bolivian military had buried him secretly, hoping to prevent any shrine to his memory. But in 1997, a Bolivian general revealed the burial location. Cuban and Argentine forensic anthropologists excavated the site and found skeletal remains matching Che's known characteristics, including evidence of old leg wounds. On October 17, 1997, exactly 30 years after his capture, Che's remains were flown to Cuba. Fidel Castro and thousands of Cubans attended the ceremony as Che was finally laid to rest in a monument in Santa Clara, the city where he'd won his greatest military victory almost 40 years earlier. His hands were missing from the discovered remains, reportedly cut off after his death for identification purposes. They've never been found. H2, Part 6, Legacy and Myth. H3, The Icon, How Che Became Immortal. That famous photograph, you know the one. Che in a beret, his hair long, his expression intense and somehow distant. Taken by photographer Alberto Corda at a memorial service in 1960. Corda never imagined it would become perhaps the most reproduced photograph in history. By the 1960s, and especially after his death, Che's image spread across the world. It appeared on posters in student dorm rooms from Berkeley to Paris to Tokyo. It was printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, reproduced in countless forms. The image came to symbolize rebellion, idealism, anti-imperialism, revolution itself. This iconography transformed Che from a specific historical person into a universal symbol. People who knew nothing about his actual life, his writings, or his actions wore his image. The face that had belonged to Ernesto Guevara became public property, a blank screen onto which anyone could project their own ideals of resistance and change. Ironically, this commercialization of Che's image, selling t-shirts and posters of the man who'd rejected capitalism, would have both amused and appalled him. He'd become exactly what he'd fought against, a commodity. The revolutionary theorist, Che's ideas. But Che was more than just an image. He was a serious revolutionary theorist whose writings influenced guerrilla movements worldwide for decades after his death. His core ideas can be summarized simply. Revolution doesn't require perfect conditions or mass organization. A small committed group, a FOCO, can create revolutionary conditions through armed struggle. The very act of fighting inspires the masses to join. Violence is not just a tactic, but a transformative experience that creates the new man, a person motivated by solidarity and moral purpose, rather than self-interest. These ideas inspired revolutionary movements across Latin America, in Guatemala, Colombia, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and elsewhere. They influenced urban guerrilla movements like Uruguay's Tupamaros and Argentina's Montoneros. They shaped liberation struggles in Africa and Asia. But Che's theories were ultimately flawed. Bolivia proved that armed struggle without popular support fails. The Congo showed that revolutionary will alone can't overcome lack of organization. And the new man Che envisioned, selfless, incorruptible, motivated purely by ideals, never materialized, even in Cuba, where economic incentives eventually had to be reintroduced because moral ones weren't enough. The dark side, violence and authoritarianism. Any honest accounting of Che's legacy must grapple with the violence he embraced and enacted. This wasn't reluctant violence, violence as a last resort. Che believed in violence as necessary and even purifying, a way to transform both society and the individual. The executions at La Cabana, the summary justice meted out to deserters and prisoners, the cold pragmatism with which he discussed killing, his willingness to risk nuclear war. These weren't aberrations. They were consistent with his worldview. Che believed that building a new society required destroying the old one and everyone who defended it. He had no patience for liberal notions of due process or individual rights when they conflicted with revolutionary necessity. The ends, a just society, justified any means required to achieve them. Critics rightfully point to this as evidence that Che was not a hero, but a war criminal. They note that the Cuba he helped build became an authoritarian state, where dissent is suppressed, where people who disagree with the government are imprisoned, where individual freedom is subordinated to state power. Defenders counter that revolution is inherently violent, that the old order never surrenders peacefully, that judging revolutionary violence without acknowledging the violence of the systems being overthrown is itself unjust. They point to American-backed dictatorships that killed far more people than Che ever did, yet whose leaders are never called murderers. This debate remains unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Che exists in a moral gray area that makes people uncomfortable. Someone who genuinely believed he was fighting for justice, who personally lived with humility and self-sacrifice, but who also killed without apparent remorse in service of those beliefs. Cuba's view: national hero or embarrassment? In Cuba, Che occupies a curious position. He's officially a national hero. His image appears on murals, monuments, currency. Every Cuban schoolchild learns about his role in the revolution. The government invokes his name and legacy constantly. Yet there's also tension. Che was more radical than Fidel, more uncompromising, less willing to accept the pragmatic compromises required to run an actual country. His economic theories failed. His emphasis on moral over material incentives didn't work. His call for continued revolution threatened stability. Some Cubans remember Che with genuine reverence, as someone who fought for Cuba's independence, who believed in the revolution's ideals, who gave everything for the cause. Others see him as a tragic figure whose idealism blinded him to reality, and many, especially younger Cubans, view him with indifference, just another government-mandated hero. The Cuba Che fought for, egalitarian, prosperous, fully independent, never quite materialized. The country he died for still struggles economically, still faces American embargo, still hasn't achieved the paradise he envisioned. Would he be disappointed? Almost certainly. Would he regret his choices? That's harder to say. The global impact, inspiration and warning. Che's influence extends far beyond Cuba. His face has appeared at protests, from Seattle to Hong Kong. His words have inspired movements for indigenous rights, environmental justice, anti-globalization. His example has motivated people to resist power, to fight for their beliefs, to imagine alternatives to capitalism. Revolutionary movements across the global South studied his writings, adopted his tactics, followed his example. Some succeeded, at least initially. The Sandinistas in Nicaragua, liberation movements in Africa. Many more failed disastrously. Their leaders killed, their followers imprisoned or worse. Che's legacy raises uncomfortable questions about violence and social change. Can revolutionary violence create a just society? Or does it corrupt even noble goals? Can individuals transform themselves into something better through struggle? Or are we all prisoners of our nature and context? Different people answer these questions differently, often based on their own political commitments, rather than historical evidence. And that's perhaps Che's most lasting legacy. He remains relevant precisely because he poses questions we still haven't answered. The personal legacy, family and relationships. Che's personal life was marked by the same contradictions as his public one. He was devoted to revolutionary ideals, but often absent from his family. He married twice, fathered 5 children, yet spent most of his adult life away from home, fighting in mountains and jungles. His first wife Hilda and daughter Hildita remained in Cuba after he left. His second wife, Aleida, and their 4 children also grew up largely without him. In his farewell letter to his children, he wrote movingly about hoping they'd become revolutionaries, but acknowledged he'd barely been a father to them. Some of his children have embraced his legacy, working in Cuban government or humanitarian causes. Others have lived quietly, uncomfortable with constant comparison to an iconic father they barely knew. His youngest daughter, Celia, became a veterinarian in Cuba. His son Camilo moved to Mexico and works as a lawyer. They carry his name, but live in his enormous shadow. Aleida March, Che's widow, spent decades protecting and promoting his legacy. She helped establish the Che Guevara Studies Center in Havana, worked to publish his writings and diaries, and fiercely defended his reputation against critics. She died in 2023, taking with her first-hand memories of the man behind the icon. The debate continues. Hero or villain? Today, more than 50 years after his death, Che remains deeply polarizing. He's simultaneously celebrated as a hero of liberation and condemned as a murderer and totalitarian. For many in Latin America, particularly those who've lived under American-backed dictatorships or neoliberal policies they view as exploitative, Che represents resistance to imperialism, a champion of the poor, someone who actually fought for his ideals rather than just talking about them. For Cuban exiles and others who fled communist regimes, Che represents oppression, violence, and failed ideology. They see him as someone whose revolutionary fervor led to suffering, whose intolerance created a repressive system, whose idealism was really fanaticism. Both views contain truth. Che was genuinely committed to ending poverty and exploitation. He lived simply, rejected wealth, risked and ultimately sacrificed his life for his beliefs. He was also capable of cold-blooded violence, intolerant of dissent, and unwilling to question whether his methods might be wrong. Perhaps the real Che exists somewhere between the extremes, neither saint nor demon, but a flawed human being who believed passionately in something larger than himself and pursued it with absolute conviction, regardless of cost. The question of what might have been. One can't help but wonder, what if Che had lived? What if he'd survived Bolivia, escaped to fight another day, or even returned to Cuba? It's impossible to know, but some clues exist in his trajectory. Che was growing increasingly critical of the Soviet Union, increasingly radical in his vision of revolution. Had he lived, he might have broken entirely with Soviet-style communism, might have articulated an alternative vision that inspired new movements. Or he might have continued fighting futile guerrilla wars in remote jungles, aging into irrelevance. His revolutionary moment passed. Or perhaps, most intriguingly, he might have faced the same crisis of faith that many revolutionaries encounter when their dreams meet reality. Would Che, at 50 or 60, still believe in armed struggle with the same fervor? Would he have evolved, adapted, reconsidered? We'll never know. His death, at 39, froze him in time, eternally young, eternally committed, eternally revolutionary. And perhaps that's part of why his image endures. He never had to face the compromises of age, never had to witness the long-term failures of his projects, never had to question whether it was all worth it. The medical student who might have been. Here's another thought worth pondering as we near the end of this long journey. What if Che had never met Fidel Castro? What if that night in Mexico City, that fateful conversation that lasted until dawn, had never happened? There was a version of Ernesto Guevara who might have become a respected physician, perhaps specializing in allergies and tropical diseases. He might have worked for humanitarian organizations, treating the poor in Latin America's most desperate regions. He would have used his medical skills to heal, might have saved thousands of lives over a long career. He certainly had the ability. He was intelligent, dedicated, genuinely cared about alleviating suffering. The young man who worked in leprosariums and treated rural peasants had the makings of a humanitarian doctor. But that Ernesto died somewhere in the mountains of Bolivia in 1952 during that first transformative motorcycle journey. Or perhaps he died in Guatemala in 1954, watching democracy crushed by foreign intervention. Or maybe he only fully disappeared in the sugarcane field at Alegria de Pio when he chose ammunition over medicine. The world got Che Guevara, the revolutionary, instead of Dr. Ernesto Guevara, the healer. Whether that was a gain or a loss depends entirely on whom you ask. The myth lives on. Today, Che's face looks out from walls around the world. It's been commodified, sanitized, divorced from its historical context. The young person wearing a Che t-shirt probably knows little about the man, his victories and failures, his idealism and violence, his asthma and his iron will. But perhaps that doesn't entirely matter. Symbols take on lives of their own, independent of their origins. Che has become a symbol of rebellion itself, of refusing to accept injustice, of believing that individuals can change the world. That symbolism resonates regardless of whether people know that Che executed prisoners at La Cabana or developed asthma as a child. The myth of Che is more powerful than the man ever was. The myth can't be killed, can't fail, can't be captured in a Bolivian schoolhouse. The myth is immortal in a way the man never could be. And yet, for all the mythologizing, Ernesto Che Guevara was a real person who lived and died. He had doubts, even if he rarely expressed them. He suffered physically, chronically, from illness he couldn't control. He loved, however imperfectly. He read poetry. He played chess. He was, despite everything, human. H2. So we come to the end of our journey, tracing the path of one remarkable, controversial, complex life. From comfortable Buenos Aires to the mountains of Cuba, from the halls of government to the jungles of Bolivia, we followed Ernesto Guevara as he transformed himself into Che, the revolutionary icon. H2. What can we conclude about such a life? What lessons can we draw from this story of conviction and contradiction? HP: Perhaps the first lesson is about the power of belief. Che believed absolutely in his vision of a just world, and that belief allowed him to endure extraordinary hardship, accomplish remarkable things, and ultimately sacrifice everything. His life demonstrates that individuals with conviction really can change history, for better or worse. The second lesson might be about the costs of that conviction. Che's absolute certainty made him effective, but it also made him ruthless. His unwillingness to compromise or question his fundamental beliefs led him to embrace violence without remorse, to see people as obstacles or tools rather than as ends in themselves. His strength was also his weakness. A third lesson concerns the gap between ideals and reality. Che envisioned a new man, a transformed society, a liberated continent. What he helped create was more complicated, more flawed, more human than his dreams allowed for. The distance between vision and outcome should make us cautious about anyone who promises utopia through violence. And perhaps a final lesson is about the enduring power of symbols. Che has transcended history to become myth. His image means different things to different people. Hero, martyr, murderer, idealist. The man himself is gone, but the conversations his life inspires continue. We're still asking the questions he raised. What do we owe to those suffering? When is violence justified? Can individuals really change systems? What are we willing to sacrifice for our beliefs? These aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers. And that's precisely why Che Guevara remains relevant more than 50 years after his death. He forces us to grapple with uncomfortable truths about power, justice, violence, and change. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you might reflect on your own beliefs. What would you fight for? What would you risk? Where is the line between necessary resistance and destructive fanaticism? What kind of world do you want to live in? And what are you willing to do to create it? Che would have wanted you to ask these questions. He believed that comfort was the enemy of justice, that complacency allowed exploitation to continue. He would have wanted you to be uncomfortable, to question, to act. Whether you agree with his answers matters less than whether you're willing to engage with his questions. So let's leave him there, in that schoolhouse in La Higuera, standing as the soldiers enter, defiant to the end. Or perhaps in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra, young and certain, believing absolutely that a better world was possible. Or on that motorcycle journey, not yet Che, but becoming him, his eyes opening to suffering he couldn't ignore. Ernesto Guevara, Che. Revolutionary, icon, contradiction. A man who tried to change the world and, in his own complicated way, succeeded. Though perhaps not in the way he intended. His life ended at 39, but his story continues, retold in different forms, inspiring and troubling each new generation that encounters it. And his face, that iconic photograph, still watches from walls and t-shirts, from murals and protests, asking silently, what do you believe in? What will you fight for? Who will you become? Sleep well. Dream of justice, of conviction, of the complicated truths that history offers us. And when you wake, perhaps you'll see the world a little differently, having spent these hours in the company of one of the 20th century's most fascinating figures. Good night.